Well, and in talking about the cost, in talking about evolving menu, and you and I have talked about this before, one of the biggest topics in do I bring something new to the table, so to speak, is cannibalization. Talk about cannibalization, and particularly to our students, we have several assignments where they have to think about that, why that is such a pivotal thing to measure.
Yeah. Not only pivotal, but it's one of the hardest things to message, or one of the hardest things to measure. Here's why it's so important, because not everything you do is incremental to the entire system, right? So, what we find sometimes, let's just use as an example, breakfast. Let's just use a breakfast period. So you have a very successful breakfast experience going on in one of our lands. So let's just say in Frontierland, there's this great breakfast experience and the guests are flocking towards it. And then you say, well, you know what, if breakfast is working so great, let's go create another breakfast experience in Tomorrowland. And then you do. And then what happens is, you start seeing people who were eating at Frontierland now go over to Tomorrowland.
Just split.
That's right.
Yeah.
So why it's so important is, there's probably still incremental value happening, but then you're going to get to a point where all you've really done is just created a bunch of costs, and you're just moving the same guests around to different places. Right? You're not really building the financial growth because you've got so many different offerings now. Cannibalization plays a role not just in food and beverage, but it also plays it in merchandise. Because again, the more offerings that you put out there, some of them are going to be incremental, and some of them are just going to be a guest saying, I'm more interested in that than I am in that. And so they'll go experience this thing, but they're not incremental to the system.
Yep.
They just made a different choice.
Yeah.
And so you just have to be very mindful of that. You have to watch it, but it's also very hard to measure at times. And what we do is we take a look at, do we see, when we introduce a new product, do we see a lift in spending? Or do you just see the same spending, it's just moved around, but in totality, you haven't really seen a change in how much food and beverage revenue you're seeing per guest happening.
Yeah, well, and there are studies also, when we think about not just food and beverage, but merchandising, there are studies also that as you get more and more choices, you also cause the consumer to think more and more about making that purchase, and you may actually compress some revenue. So you have to also try and balance out, are we giving them too many choices?
Yes. And we talked earlier about complexity and friction points. And I do think too many choices is a complexity.
Yes.
And the more the consumer...
It may create indecision on their part.
And it possibly could take them out of the story, right?
Yeah.
It could, because now they're thinking about that versus thinking about being a part of the experience overall. So you're always trying to find ways to keep them in the mindset of the experience that they're having. And I think, Andy, it's a great point that if you start asking them to think about too many different things, then that's what they're thinking about.
Yeah.